Hello and welcome back, everyone, to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked the first segment, getting back into the swing of talking basketball. But before we move on to the second segment, I do want to remind you guys yet again to leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to the network, me, my fellow podcasters. So do consider doing that. We are going to stick with this graphic for the second segment. No, it is not the Stanley Cup final one just yet. It is, in fact, the NBA Finals one. Who I think are the most vital fantasy options that you should roster going forward in terms of daily fantasy basketball. A lot of interesting players, a lot of interesting storylines in this segment, so I'm really thrilled to present this one to you guys. So without further ado, let's get straight into it, starting off with a number 10 player who we already mentioned last segment, PJ Washington. What an acquisition he has been for the Dallas Mavericks this season. He comes over from the Charlotte Hornets when Dallas is kind of in the midst of a battle to kind of reach into the upper echelon of the Western Conference standings. What do? They acquire PJ Washington, and all of a sudden they become a fantastic team that isn't revolving around just two players, and that is the reason why the Dallas Mavericks are where they are right now. PJ Washington this season, 1,809.7 fantasy points overall. In these past 10 games, however, he really shined with 286.2 fantasy points in the past 10. Ultimately, he is going to be one of the defensive cogs in the Dallas Mavericks machine when Boston Celtics are on their offensive attack. PJ Washington is a huge part of that defensive game plan. It's not just guys who we're going to get to in the future like Derek Lively and Dan Gafford, but PJ Washington just adds that physicality and grit to a Mavs team that really wants to focus on not just Luka and Kyrie's production, but overall teamwork ethic. And PJ Washington is the face of that kind of movement. He has been the face of their defensive front. He has helped this Dallas team find a different identity that doesn't just revolve around superstardom. And I really am excited to see how PJ Washington pans out in this NBA Finals. I think he's one of the most exciting players to watch in the NBA Finals going forward. Coming in at the number 9 position, this is kind of a weird pick in my opinion, but ultimately, I think that he can play a factor here, and that is Maxi Kleber. Obviously, his stats have not been that good, mainly just because he's been injured. Obviously, he suffered an AC joint separation 2 series ago, and he tried to come back in the past conference final series against Minnesota, but as we saw, he really did not look ready or fit to play in that series. But he is a huge asset, not only in real life, but to your fantasy team, should he play and should his stats kind of inflate as his injury heals. So it's going to be interesting also to see how Jason Kidd tries and rotates him in, because he already has that steady kind of front court partnership in Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford because of the fact that Maxi Kleber was injured. So I think that Maxi Kleber is going to be a player that is slowly integrated into these finals if he's feeling up to it. But just look out for him on your daily fantasy boards, because I think he is a interesting kind of asset that adds another dimension to this Dallas defensive front. So I think Maxi Kleber at number 9 can be a surprise to people, but I feel confident putting him here should he play. Coming in at number 8, another guy who's going to be critical in this series, more offensively than defensively, because obviously, as we saw, he had his defensive struggles in the Pacers series. Al Horford. Al Horford has been a guy who wants to reach that mountaintop. He has been a journeyman in this league for quite some time, and he knows what it takes to face adversity, face struggles in this league, and he just wants to help this Celtics team in a championship window that's closing more rapidly than people think get over the hump finally. I just think that Big Al, in terms of offensive output, can have a huge game, as we saw in game 3 of the Indiana Pacers series, where his three-pointers helped Boston propel themselves to that win there. So obviously he's not going to be as reliable as some of the players higher up on this list, mainly due to his defensive liabilities. But Al Horford is going to be an interesting option in these NBA Finals, because I think Joe Mazzulla wants to use him in a more offensive role. Obviously, he wants to bring back KP to help defensively. So someone in kind of that big man realm is going to need to step up offensively, and I think Al Horford can be the person to do that. So look out for him if you just want more of that oomph for your offensive front. He did have 257.1 fantasy points over the last 10 games in these playoffs. He had 1,461.6 fantasy points this season. So you can see the up and down variance of his fantasy game. But I feel kind of okay putting him here because I do like him offensively as a weapon for the Celtics. Coming in at number 7 is a player we've talked about a lot on this channel. A player I'm really thrilled has made his first NBA Finals as a rookie, no less. Has been a huge part in their postseason run, especially in their defensive identity, being one of the better defenses in the postseason. That is Derek Lively II. He had 225.11 fantasy points in his last 10 games, 1,202.6 fantasy points as a rookie. Not too bad. Obviously, he is more known for his defense. He's not going to put up the offensive production you would want in a fantasy player, but he can steal you a couple games because of his defense. And this defensive matchup against Kristaps Porzingis is going to be very intriguing, because obviously Derek Lively is this energetic young forward in this Dallas system who is going to want to heighten the pace of the game, wants to move the tempo of the game, and Kristaps Porzingis might not be ready for him. So look for him to perhaps elevate his scoring potential and also maintain his defensive solidity. So Derek Lively at the number 7 spot is all right with me because of the fact that in this matchup with Kristaps Porzingis, he may have the slight advantage due to the fact that Kristaps Porzingis hasn't really played that much. So look out for Derek Lively in these finals. Coming in at number 6, the man of the moment, it seems, Kristaps Porzingis. This kind of player that when he's on his game just adds that versatility that the Celtics offense and defense really needs, to just adds that height and length that really isn't in this Celtics team absent of him. So I really do believe that Kristaps Porzingis is one of the better fantasy options in this NBA Finals, should he live up to the hype of who he means to the Celtics. In the past 10 fantasy points he's played, obviously this is kind of going back to the regular season. He did not play much in the playoffs. He had 353.6 fantasy points. So you can see how much he means to the Celtics as a fantasy player. This season he had 2,025.3 fantasy points overall. So you can see that Kristaps Porzingis not only is a fantastic player for the Celtics in real life, but is also a high-end fantasy asset. You're going to have to kind of wait this guy out, see how he does in game 1, maybe not roster him for game 1, maybe for game 2 if he proves that he's fully fit and ready to go for the Celtics. But moving forward, he still is a huge fantasy asset for you, should you be willing to take the risk. Coming in at number 5, this might shock a lot of people, but it doesn't shock me at all because I really love what this guy has done in the postseason, and that is Dan Gafford. Hugest defensive player in this series, in my opinion, just due to the fact that I think combined with Derek Lively, he is one of the more intriguing fantasy options in this list. He, in the last couple of games, has been perfect in terms of field goal shooting percentage. So if you want a guy who doesn't score that many points but has that nice, good shooting percentage that you're looking for, look out for him. In his past 10 fantasy games, he had 230.1 points. So you can see he's not necessarily the scorer that you would want. He has 2,022.9 fantasy points this season. So he puts them right on edge with Kristaps Porzingis in terms of fantasy production overall. And moving into this matchup, I don't think he'll necessarily be directly on Porzingis. He'll switch with Derek Lively back and forth. So he's definitely going to get his defensive production, but look for him to be one of those kind of scoring threats outside of Luka and Kyrie that can really help these Mavericks make this a series. Coming in at number 4, this is going to shock a lot of people as well because this is a string of Celtics players. I did leave Kyrie Irving off this list just to warn you guys, just because of the fact that while he is an interesting asset fantasy-wise, I wanted to highlight more of these kind of role player guys who can really make a difference not only on the court, but in your fantasy squad. So, fair word of warning there. But coming in at number 4 is Jrue Holiday, another key acquisition that the Celtics made that truly made them the genuine title contenders and title favorites for this year. Jrue Holiday is an incredible defensive player, incredible offensive production as well when he's on his game and feeling it. In the past couple of games, only 1,911.1 fantasy points for the entire season. In the past couple of games, he had 307.7 fantasy points there. So you can see that Jrue Holiday is coming to life in this postseason, proving that he is the key acquisition the Celtics needed. Obviously, a huge defensive series against the Indiana Pacers. A couple key steals there, a couple key blocks. Overall, him and Derek White are one of the best defensive backcourts in the league and in these NBA Finals. I do believe that those two are going to be the cogs for the Celtics defensively at the very least, combined with Kristaps, who is really up in the air. So expect Jrue Holiday to have a huge series as kind of the barometer for the Celtics on offense and kind of that bell cow on the Celtics defense for them. Coming in at number 3, a guy who's had an incredible postseason, Eastern Conference Finals MVP against Indiana, Jaylen Brown. Jaylen Brown has been one of those fantasy players who has this huge spurts all of a sudden. In my opinion, is quickly becoming the Celtics' best player. I think that he is ultimately better than Jason Tatum. His fantasy stats, on the other hand, are very volatile, but in these NBA Finals, I do expect him to have a fantastic series, continue his offensive output, there. In the past 10 games, he had 375.4 fantasy points. That is a huge number for him to put up. In the season, he had 2,521.4 fantasy points. So as you can see, Jaylen Brown, highly volatile guy, but I do expect him to have a fantastic NBA Finals. Obviously, a lot of pressure is on his shoulders, not as much on Jason Tatum's shoulders, but still the pressure will be there for him. But I think he's quickly overcoming it and developing into the player we know he can be in both real life and fantasy. So I'm really thrilled to see how he plays in this series. Coming in at number 2, probably the most scrutinized player in this series. If the Celtics lose, the pundits and other sports talk radio shows will be saying that this guy is the reason why, and it's Jason Tatum. I've talked about Jason Tatum a lot in terms of fantasy on this show, and as you know, he is a very, very, very scrutinized fantasy player as well as in real life. But he is proving that this postseason, while he's not necessarily putting up the offensive production people would expect of a guy trying to break into superstardom, he is very, very, very fantastic fantasy-wise. In the last 10 games, he averaged 500.5 fantasy points. That is a huge, fantastic number for him. In the season, he averaged 3,302.2 fantasy points there. So overall, you can see that Jason Tatum is one of those fantasy players who you're like, okay, I'm going to take a risk on this guy because I think he can give me a lot of different stats that I need, a lot of different areas of need that he hits. But ultimately, he is one of those guys who you really are kind of betting and wishing and hoping on to maintain that level. So we're going to have to see. That is going to be the question for Jason Tatum moving forward. Can he, both in real life and in fantasy, maintain those good stretches of fantasy production and real life production? That is the question. That is why he's high as number 2 on this list, but number 1 overall. It should be no surprise to you all. It is in fact Luka Doncic, the best player in the world, the best player in this postseason. We cannot say enough about him in terms of the NBA right now. I think that if the Mavs somehow win this series, Luka will be the new face of the NBA and one of the potential MVP favorites for the next decade or so. I think he's quickly becoming one of those guys who you can't necessarily find any good defensive matchups that you're feeling solid about. So he's definitely going to have a lot of points. It is reflected in his past 10 game stats as well. In his past 10 games, a whopping 553 fantasy points. That is incredible. In the season, he blows a guy like Jason Tatum out of the water with 4,167.4 fantasy points. You can see that Luka Doncic is as good as gold in terms of fantasy. He gets you points. He not only cares about getting points, but he cares about distributing the ball to his role players. He's learning that quickly now in these playoffs, and it's the reason why he is in this position. He also sometimes gets rebounds, so he's overall a triple-double machine that you will have no worries about putting into your fantasy options. Obviously, in terms of most important, you can be kind of skeptical about it because, okay, he's just the guy who you can lock in and be worried about. That's the point. Luka Doncic is the only lock in terms of fantasy basketball in my mind that people can be truly confident about producing at every single stat line. So that should just about do it for these top 10 fantasy options for the NBA Finals. After the break, we will switch over to the NHL, where I'll be discussing my top 10 fantasy options for the Stanley Cup Finals. It should be a great segment that you guys will not want to miss. We'll be right back on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports